This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and today is Wednesday. That means it's time for another MTG Top 10. In some episodes of this series, I look at the most expensive cards in a particular category and explain what it is that makes them so expensive, and that's what I'm doing today, with a look at the game's most expensive sorceries. There are a few things to keep in mind about how I compile this type of list. First, a set can only appear on the list once, so if a set would have multiple cards appear on it, I simply take a look at the 3 most expensive cards from that set. This type of list is already going to be skewed towards older sets, and this prevents that from being quite as pronounced. Additionally, I only count the regular versions of cards. In other words, no promotional or foil versions of cards are considered. The prices in the video are the price for that card's original printing. Lastly, the prices in the video are Card Kingdom near mint prices, and as usual, if you want to own any of these cards, you can find links for them in the description. Alright, let's take a look at Magic's most expensive sorceries. At number 10, it is Finale of Devastation, which costs about $50. This sorcery costs X and a green, and lets you search your library and or graveyard for a creature with a mana value X or less, and put it onto the battlefield. Then, if you spent 10 or more mana on X, your whole team also gets +6/+6 and haste, including your brand new creature. So, this can search up an ideal creature for a given situation, something that can be pretty valuable, and the huge upside if you manage to pump a ton of mana into it is pretty insane. Also, the fact it can get stuff out of your graveyard is a big deal. Green has a lot of cards that let you tutor up creatures and put them into play, so that part of the card isn't that special, but this is the only one that also gives you the option of reanimating something. Finale of Devastation has seen a bit of play in 60-card constructed formats. In the past, it was used in Bant ramp decks and Standard, where spending 10 on X wasn't completely out of the question. It's also currently seeing play in Modern, where it can be used to help assemble creature-based combos like Devoted Druid plus Vizier of Remedies. However, the biggest factor on its high price tag is Commander. It sees play in over 107,000 decks on EDHREC, or around 10% of all the green decks in the database. This sort of tutor gets even better in EDH, where you're playing a singleton format, and enough green decks are all about generating obscene amounts of mana that this can function as a win condition in the later stages of the game. At number 9, I have the 2 most expensive sorceries from Portal, Sylvan Tutor, which costs about $80, and Personal Tutor, which costs about $70. Sylvan Tutor lets you search up a creature and put it on top of your library, and Personal Tutor does the same thing, but with a sorcery. Because they're from a Portal set, a series of sets that were designed as a simplified version of Magic that was intended to be an introductory product, they weren't actually legal in Magic's tournament setting until 2005, when they became legal in Legacy and Vintage. Sylvan Tutor has never really made it in 60-card formats, but Personal Tutor has seen and continues to see significant play in Legacy. These days, it regularly helps Doomsday decks search up the eponymous card. Like most tutors, they are both fairly heavily played in Commander, although their scarcity helps suppress just how much they can be played. For a very long time, the Portal versions of these cards were your only options. That is about to change for Personal Tutor, at least, because it's been revealed that it's getting a reprint in Commander Masters. It wouldn't be a complete surprise if Sylvan Tutor also made it into the set. This will probably result in their prices dropping a bit and make them more obtainable for Commander players. At number 8, it is Grim Tutor, giving us our 3rd straight slot that is filled by a tutor effect. For 1 generic and 2 black, Grim Tutor lets you search up any card and put it into your hand, and you lose 3 life. Like Sylvan and Personal Tutor, Grim Tutor is from a weird set, in this case, Starter 1999. Like the Portal sets, this was intended as an introductory product, and it didn't become legal in Magic's 60-card competitive formats until 05. Like most good tutors, Grim Tutor sees play in Legacy combo decks like Storm. It also sees a lot of play in Commander, appearing in almost 88,000 decks on EDHREC. Unlike pretty much all the other cards on this list, you can obtain a cheaper version of Grim Tutor since it received a reprint in M21. At number 7, it's Replenish. For 3 generic and a white, this sorcery returns all enchantment cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Obviously, if you can get enough enchantments into your graveyard, one way or another, Replenish can be quite powerful. Back in the late 90s, its full power was unleashed in an extended combo deck that milled and discarded cards until the graveyard had Parallax Tide, Parallax Wave, and Opalescence. Once they were there, you could cast Replenish and go off. Here's how this worked. Opalescence made the Parallax enchantments into creatures, so the Wave's ability could target them. First, you use the Tide to exile 5 of your opponent's lands, and in response to that, you exile the Tide with the Wave. The Leave the Battlefield trigger resolves before the Tide's land removal effect does, so your opponent never gets those lands back. Then you can use the Wave to exile 3 creatures, and then itself, which also means they never get those creatures back. Then the Tide and the Wave both return to the battlefield, and you can do it as many times as necessary, crippling your opponent and allowing you to win by attacking with your enchantment creatures. While the combo is a bit convoluted, the fact you really only needed Replenish to make it work made it too consistent of a combo, and Replenish got banned and extended. It has also seen some play in Legacy Enchantress decks over the years, but right now it isn't seeing any significant play in Magic's 60-card formats. It sees decent play in Commander, appearing in almost 15,000 decks, but you can be pretty sure that every enchantment deck would be playing Replenish if it weren't for the price tag. And the biggest factor in that high price is the fact that Replenish is on the reserved list. This is a list of old, higher rarity cards that Wizards of the Coast has promised never to reprint. Cards on the reserved list always get a huge bump in how much they cost because, in theory at least, all the copies of this card that will ever exist already do, making it really scarce. At number 6, I have the 3 most expensive sorceries from Urza Saga: Yawgmoth's Will, which costs about $150, Time Spiral, which costs about $120, and Show and Tell, which costs $55. Yeah, Urza Saga was a busted set. These 3 cards are some of the most powerful ones we've ever seen, and all 3 have constantly seen play in Magic ever since the day they were printed way back in 1998. Both Yawgmoth's Will and Time Spiral are on the reserved list, resulting in their elevated price. Yawgmoth's Will costs 3 mana and lets you cast cards and play lands from your graveyard for the remainder of your turn. This can really enable combo decks to go wild, especially if they are casting ritual effects that net them mana. It isn't unusual for someone to cast their entire graveyard after casting Yawgmoth's Will, and obviously that delivers insane game-winning value. Urza Saga is famous for introducing several cards that resulted in utterly busted combo decks, ushering in a period known as Combo Winter, and Yawgmoth's Will was a big part of that. To get things under control, Yawgmoth's Will and many other cards ended up getting banned everywhere except Vintage, where it was restricted. Many Vintage decks do still run the single copy of Yawgmoth's Will they are allowed, so it does still see a lot of play there. It is legal in Commander, where it sees significant play, especially when you consider how expensive it is to obtain Yawgmoth's Will. Time Spiral costs 6 mana and exiles itself, then each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and draws 7 cards. Then, you get to untap 6 lands. The last part effectively makes Time Spiral free, and combining an effect that reloads your hand with an effect that gives you all of your mana back is insane, because it means you'll be able to cast some of your brand new cards right away before your opponent ever can. Things got particularly silly if you could draw into another Time Spiral on the same turn and just keep going. There were many decks in multiple formats that looked to do exactly that, especially while untapping powerful lands like Tolarian Academy, which would make you net insane amounts of mana and eventually win you the game. Like Yawgmoth's Will, Time Spiral ended up getting banned everywhere, but Vintage, where it was restricted, as it was simply too powerful for a long time. Unlike Yawgmoth's Will, it is legal in Legacy these days and can be played as a full 4-of in Vintage, and it does see modest play in both formats today. Lastly, there's Show and Tell. This 3-mana sorcery allows both players to put an artifact, creature, enchantment, or land from their hand onto the battlefield. While it's definitely powerful and has been played a ton in multiple formats over the years, it does pale in comparison to the other 2 Urza Saga sorceries we just discussed. For one thing, it's never been banned or restricted anywhere. However, it makes up for that by being an incredibly important card in both Legacy and Vintage, and especially Legacy, where it's helped power Sneak and Show decks for 15 years. While Show and Tell's effect is symmetrical, these decks are built to abuse it, so they always put something into play far more powerful than their opponent ever will, something like Atraxa or Gristlebrand. Show and Tell is in far more demand for 60-card formats than either Yawgmoth's Will or Time Spiral, but it sees a lot less play in Commander. You can see how Show and Tell gets a lot worse when you're playing against multiple opponents, since all of them will be able to put something into play, and in Commander, they're more likely to have something insane in their hand. At number 5, it is Transmute Artifact, which costs about $330. This 2-mana sorcery allows you to sacrifice an artifact to search your library for an artifact. You can put it directly into play if the artifact you sacrificed has a mana value less than or equal to the one you sacrificed. If it's more expensive, you have to pay the difference or it goes to the graveyard. This is obviously a powerful way to tutor up an artifact, and while it does pale in comparison to Tinker, it does a pretty good impression of that super powerful card, and unlike Tinker, it is legal as a full 4 of in both Legacy and Vintage, and over the years, artifact decks in those formats have made use of it, though we wouldn't really call it heavily played. It is also in around 10,000 decks on EDHREC, a number that would definitely be a lot higher if it wasn't so expensive. Transmute Artifact is of course another reserve list card, and it's from a set that was released way back in 1994, so if you want to get your hands on it, you have to pay a premium. At number 4, it is Charizard. This is one of the most obnoxious and poorly designed cards in the history of Magic. When you cast this sorcery, you have to play an entire sub-game of Magic, which means you play an entirely new game with the cards that are still in your deck in the main game at that point. Then, when that sub-game ends, the player who lost that sub-game loses half the life they had in the original game, and then you have to go back and finish that game. Things get even sillier if someone casts Charizard during one of those sub-games. Don't get me wrong, the card definitely delivers on the flavor of the narrator of 1001 Nights, the literary anthology that the set Arabian Nights is based on. The anthology has a framed story with Charizard as the narrator, and she tells all of the stories in the anthology in an attempt to continue to distract her new husband, who famously beheads every woman he marries after they consummate their marriage. So, yeah, the flavor here is on point because playing this card makes your Magic games feel like they've been going on for 1001 nights, but when you look at what this card does to games of Magic, it is truly an abomination. In fact, the card is considered so oppressive that it's banned in every format that it would be legal in, including Commander. Not because it's powerful, but because it can make games of Magic stretch on for eternity. So, in this case, neither Commander nor 60-card formats have anything to do with Charizard's price tag. The card is exceedingly rare, coming from Magic's very first expansion, and it's on the reserve list. Those things alone wouldn't be enough to make it so expensive, though. Other cards in Arabian Nights that are on the reserve list that aren't played anywhere aren't nearly as expensive as this. That's because there's also significant demand for this card, even if you can't really play it anywhere, because the card is so famous for having such a wacky effect. At number 3, it's the 3 most expensive sorceries from Legends. Eureka, which costs around $700, All Hallows Eve, which costs around $500, and Hellfire, which costs around $160. All 3 of these are on the reserve list. Of these, Eureka is the only one that has seen any play in 60-card formats. It's kind of a green version of Show and Tell. For 4 mana, it lets you put a permanent from your hand onto the battlefield. Then your opponent gets to do the same thing, and this continues until no one puts a card on the battlefield. It sees some play alongside Show and Tell and Legacy, giving the deck some redundancy. It's far from being a regular inclusion in the deck, though. As with Show and Tell, Eureka is not very good in Commander and doesn't see very much play there. All Hallows Eve is a 4-mana sorcery that gets exiled with 2 scream counters on it when you cast it. Once it's out of scream counters, both players get to reanimate everything from their graveyards. Only paying 4 mana for a mass reanimation effect is pretty impressive, even if you do have to wait a while and the effect is entirely symmetrical. However, it has never seen play in 60-card formats and is hardly played at all in EDH, but the card is in really high demand despite not really being played anywhere, kind of like Charizard. All Hallows Eve is personally one of my favorite cards because Halloween is my favorite holiday, and it's really cool to have a Magic card that represents it. Basically, this is a card that lots of people want to own because of what it represents, not because of its effect. Lastly, there's Hellfire. This 5-mana sorcery destroys all non-black creatures, and then does X plus 3 damage to you, where X is the number of creatures that it kills. If you're playing a mono-black deck, and your opponent is playing a deck that isn't black at all, this becomes a one-sided wrath. And that's a powerful thing to have, even with downside. However, it is pretty hard to control that sort of thing, so it has never seen play in 60-card formats and is played very sparingly in EDH. At number 2, it is the 3 most expensive sorceries from Portal 3 Kingdoms: Imperial Seal, which costs about $900, Ravages of War, which costs $350, and Capture of Jingzhou, which costs about $300. Like the other Portal set we discussed earlier, these were part of a standalone version of Magic that had simplified rules. This one is even more unique though, because it was largely designed for Asian markets. While none of these cards are on the reserve list, they are really difficult to get your hands on. Funnily enough, all 3 of these are set-appropriate versions of cards that had already been printed in mainstream Magic. Imperial Seal is a sorcery version of Vampiric Tutor. Portal 3 Kingdoms didn't actually have instants, so that's why this one has a different card type. Ravages of War is identical to Armageddon, and Capture of Jingzhou is identical to Time Warp. Like most cheap tutors, Imperial Seal is banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage, but the one copy of it is played in mini combo decks in the format, and it sees a ton of play in EDH, like most great tutors do. It's in over 70,000 decks right now in EDH Rec. You can obtain other versions of Imperial Seal for a lower price since it was reprinted in Double Masters, and this has contributed to it seeing so much play. Ravages of War hasn't seen play in 60-card formats or Commander, despite being identical to Armageddon. Demand for it isn't especially high, but it's never been reprinted, elevating its price. Lastly, there's Capture of Jingzhou, which also hasn't seen play in 60-card formats. It is played more in EDH than Ravages of War, meaning it is in a bit more demand, but Capture is also just about to get a reprint in Commander Masters, so its price may drop in the future. And at number 1, probably not coming as much of a surprise, I have the 3 most expensive sorceries from Alpha, which was the very first printing of Magic's very first set. The top 2 were of course the sorceries from the Power 9. A collection of 9 cards that are largely considered the most powerful cards in the game, and that's a status they have had since Magic's earliest days. Those 2 sorceries are Time Twister and Time Walk, which have a combined price of $53,000. After that, it's Wheel of Fortune, which costs a mere $16,000. Time Twister is similar to Time Spiral, which we saw earlier, except it costs half the mana. It has both players shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library and draw 7 new cards. While it doesn't untap your lands, the fact it is so cheap makes it pretty easy for you to quickly take advantage of all your new cards. It's widely considered the weakest card in the Power 9. It sees significant play in Vintage, though it is far from an auto-include like most of the other cards in the Power 9, and it's the only card of the 9 that is actually legal in Commander. This plays a role in it actually being more expensive than Time Walk, even though that card is considered far more powerful. Time Walk gives you an extra turn for only 2 mana, which is insane. Taking an extra turn is one of the most powerful things you can do in Magic, and most cards that can do it cost 5 or more mana, so this blows all of those out of the water. It sees play in any Vintage deck that can cast it, as you really want to have access to the ability to take an extra turn so efficiently. It's so iconic that we use the term Time Walk to refer to any effect that gives you an extra turn. Lastly, there's Wheel of Fortune, a 3-mana sorcery that forces both players to discard their hand and draw 7 new cards. We've already seen on this list just how powerful it is to reload your hand efficiently, and this is yet another way to do it. While it isn't part of the Power 9, it is just as legal as they are in Magic's 60-card formats. In other words, it's banned everywhere but Vintage, where it's restricted. As with Time Walk, Wheel of Fortune is so iconic that we refer to these types of effects as wheel effects. It sees regular play in Vintage, where it is often combined with Hull Breacher and more recently Shieldred the Apocalypse for insane value, but it's far from a staple. However, it does see significant play in Commander, appearing in almost 75,000 decks on EDH Rec. So those are the most expensive sorceries in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards because maybe you have cash burning a hole in your pocket or something, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. Thanks for watching.